In our last presentation, we talked about what would happen in terms of the transference of sin. We talked about sin being brought away from the sinner through the ministration of the priest into the temple or the sanctuary, and it was constantly being brought closer and closer to the presence of God. And today we are talking about the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement. We are focusing on the process of removal of sin. That's a concept that we are going to be looking at as we go along. The Old Testament provides the foundational understanding for the sanctuary. It is in the Old Testament that we find its the descriptions of its physical structure, and we have somewhat covered it in the past presentation. When we look at the sanctuary, we are looking at something that has basically three parts. First, there is the outer court, which was a common area where the common worshippers would be able to access. That's where they would be able to bring their sin offering. That is where the altar of burnt offering was located. That's where also the basin where the priest washed their hands and their feet, that's where it was located. Then you move into the holy place and the most holy place. The holy place was the place where you had three items of furniture. You had the table of shewbread, you had the altar of incense, and you also have the 7 golden candlesticks. Those were in the holy place. Only the priests would be able to get into the holy place. The common worshipper ended in the courtyard. They did not come into the holy place. So on a daily basis, the priests would come and do their work, which brought them into the holy place. But they were not allowed to get into the most holy place. Only the high priest, once a year, would get into the most holy place on the Day of Atonement. And that's the day that we are going to be talking about today. The earthly sanctuary, therefore, had two ministries. It had a daily ministry and there was a yearly ministry. The daily ministry was confined to the outer court as well as the holy place, and it dealt with the daily confessed sins of the people as they came and brought their sacrifices, and their sins were dealt with right there in the holy place. The yearly ministry was carried out in the most holy place, and it was carried out once a year, and it dealt with the confessed accumulated sins of the people of God. So the daily ministry dealt with the daily occurrences of sin in the life of the believer. When a believer realized that they had done something against God, then they had resort to the daily ministry. They would bring a lamb, and through the process of sacrifice and transference, that sin was dealt with. They brought the sacrifice to the altar of burnt offering, and they laid their hands on the animal, they made confession, and they slaughtered it. That's part of the daily ministry. The priest would dip their finger into the blood. They would apply some of the blood on the horns of the altar. They would apply some of it onto the horns of the altar of incense. They would pour some of the blood at the base of the altar. And in some of the instances, the priest would eat some of the flesh of the offering that had been brought by the sinner. All of this involved the process of transference that we talked about in another presentation. In the daily ministry, sin was progressively transferred to the sanctuary. We talked about that. The process of atonement involved God bringing the sinner along with his sin toward the sanctuary, then in taking over the sin of the sinner, bringing it into the sanctuary itself through this process of transference and substitution. At the end of the atonement process, the daily atonement process, the sinner was clean. They could go home feeling spiritually clean, morally clean, because they had been made clean through the blood of the Lamb. But the sin's guilt had been brought into the sanctuary, and on a daily basis there was an accumulation of the sins of the people in the sanctuary. There was a defilement that was taking place in the sanctuary. Sin defiles. Sin defiles whatever it touches. So the sinner who has sinned is defiled by their sin. And when they confess their sin over the head of the lamb, that lamb is defiled by the sin. And when the priest brings the blood of the sacrifice into the sanctuary is being defiled by sin. And so this process of daily transference was bringing this defilement to the throne. Leviticus chapter 4, verses 30 and 31. Then the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger, put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and pour all the remaining blood at the base of the altar. He shall remove of its fat, as fat is removed from the sacrifice of the peace offering. The priest shall burn it on the altar or as a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord. So the priest shall make atonement for him, that is for the sinner, and it shall be forgiven him. So through the process, the sinner got forgiven. The sinner could walk away. They could walk back home. They are forgiven because of this process that has taken place. So I want you to notice that in the book of Leviticus, the word atonement is used a number of times in connection with the daily service. Leviticus chapter 4, verse 4, verse 20, verse 26, verse 31, verse 35, and more verses. These verses use the word atonement in connection with the daily process of forgiving the sinner. Thus, the daily process of sacrifices resulted in atonement. Atonement is a reconciliation. It is a bringing together or a resolving of a problem between a sinner and his God. It is the process of covering the sin that has been confessed. The sinner is not covered so that God doesn't see it. It is not pretending that nothing wrong has happened. When atonement is done in the Bible, it is a process of covering the sin with blood. It is the blood of an innocent one covering the sin of the guilty one. So sin is forgiven through the process of atonement, the process of covering. The blood of the innocent covers the sin of the guilty. Now let us look at the Day of Atonement. We have talked about the rake that is constantly bringing the trash away from the sinner towards God. So we have followed the sinner and their sin, coming away from the village, coming away from the town, coming away from the suburb. They are coming with their sacrifice, and they come to the sanctuary or the tabernacle. And then the process of transference begins. So this sin is being wreaked towards the sanctuary and is being left in the sanctuary day by day. All kinds of sin are finding their final place in the sanctuary. They are being left there. And the sinners who have confessed their sins are walking away back to their places of accommodation, places of abode. They are walking with a sense of freedom, a sense of being forgiven, a sense of newness, a sense of connectedness, because their sin has been taken away. But that sin has been brought into the presence of God. Leviticus chapter 16 focuses on the Day of Atonement activities. The Day of Atonement is a description of events that took place once a year, the day on which the accumulated sins of the people are being removed away from the sanctuary. How did that go about? Let's follow Leviticus 16. 16 verses 3 and 4 says, "Thus Aaron shall come into the holy place with the blood of a young bull as a sin offering and of a ram as a burnt offering. And he shall put the holy linen tunic and the linen trousers on his body, and he shall be girded with a linen sash, and with the linen turban he shall be attired. These are holy garments. Therefore he shall wash his body in water and put them on. So there is a very careful, detailed description of what happens on the Day of Atonement. Aaron, the high priest, is going to begin the process of the Day of Atonement activities, and he begins by washing himself. And after he has washed himself, then he puts on the various garments. He puts on the holy tunic, the linen tunic, the linen trousers, the linen sash, the linen turban. All of these he attires or he puts on, and these are described as holy garments. So the holy garments are now fully covering the priest as he begins his work. This is only the high priest who does this kind of thing. Verses 5 and 6, Leviticus 16, verses 5 and 6. And he shall take from the congregation of the children of Israel 2 kids of goats as a sin offering, and 1 ram as a burnt offering. And Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering, which is for himself, and make atonement for himself and for his house. So on the Day of Atonement, one of the beginning activities is for the priest, the high priest, to make an atonement for himself and for his household. He is going to get into the most holy place, the place that he can only enter once a year, and he needs to be spiritually ready. So he begins by taking a bath. He puts on those garments that have been described. Then he takes a bull that is going to be used as a special offering for himself and for his family, to atone for his own sins and the sins of his own house. This is preparation for the very special activities of the Day of Atonement. It was an important day, and it was important for the high priest to carefully prepare for it. Then after he has done the bullock offering, and he has atoned for himself and his own household, then the priest, the high priest, shall take the 2 goats. We are looking at verses 7 to 9. He shall take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the door of the tent of meeting. Then Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 goats, one for the Lord and the other one as a scapegoat, or as the goat of Azazel. And Aaron shall bring the goat on which the Lord's lot fell, and he shall offer it as a sin offering. So there are these 2 kids, 2 goats, 2 young goats that have been chosen. They both are in a perfect state, as perfect as they can be, and lots are cast over them to decide which one is for what function. One goat is for the Lord. The other goat is known as the scapegoat, or the goat of Azazel. So the 2 goats are separated, and the goat that is for the Lord will be burnt as a burnt offering for the people. So the goat that is for Azazel, that goat was supposed to carry on a special function. Verse 10, Leviticus 16 verse 10 says, "But the goat on which the lot fell to be the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord." Notice it is presented alive, it is not killed. And it shall to make atonement upon it, and to let it go as a scapegoat into the wilderness. So this second goat is not killed. It is not slaughtered on the altar. Rather, it is going to be sent out into the wilderness at the end of the Day of Atonement activities. It is interesting to note in verses 12 and 13, Leviticus 16, verses 12 and 13, "Then he shall take a censer full of burning coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, with his hands full of sweet incense beaten fine, and he shall bring it inside the veil. And he shall put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat that is on the testimony, lest he die." The mercy seat we mentioned is the lid of the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place. So the high priest is now going to enter the most holy place. But he begins by taking this, he has done a washing of himself, he has atoned for his family. He is now going to get into the most sacred activities of the Day of Atonement. And so he takes this incense and he puts it on the altar of incense, and he puts a fire, a coal on it, so it starts burning, producing this sweet-smelling aroma. And this aroma and the smoke ascends and goes over the curtain into the most holy place, over the mercy seat. And he says he is supposed to do that, and the smoke of the incense goes over the mercy seat so that he may not die. So he's dealing with very sacred responsibilities. Leviticus 16, verses 14 and 15. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the mercy seat, on the east side, and on the mercy seat before him. And he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. Then he shall kill the goat for the offering and bring it for the people. Bring its blood inside the veil, to do with the blood as he did with the blood of the bull, and he shall sprinkle it on the mercy seat before the Lord. So first he dealt with the blood of the bull, now he deals with the blood of the goat that was supposed to be for the sin offering, the one that represented all the people of Israel. And he does the same thing, he sprinkles it before the mercy seat in the most holy place. Verse 16, Leviticus 16, verse 16. So he shall make atonement for the holy place because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel, because of their transgressions, for all their sins. So he shall do for the tabernacle of the meeting, which remains among them, in the midst of their uncleanness. I want you to notice or look at this verse carefully. So first, he is to make atonement for the holy place, that is for the tabernacle. And he is making atonement, it says, because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel. Notice he talked about the rake that continually rakes the dirty stuff towards you, the one who is raking. So we talked about the process of transference, bringing the sin away from the sinner towards the place of God's residence, towards the holy place, the tabernacle. So he is making atonement, the high priest is making atonement of the holy place because of the uncleanness of the children of Israel. So their accumulated sin that has been transferred to the sanctuary now must be dealt with. And this atonement that is being done is because of the uncleanness of the sins of the people. So I may confess my sin, and my sin is taken away from me. I am forgiven. I just confess my sin, and it's gone. I'm free. I can go away singing and whistling and joyful because my sin has been forgiven. And to me, that process of confession and forgiveness is free. It is just by God's grace. I don't pay anything. It is free. But I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, sin is very expensive. It is costly to God. It causes God pain. It causes God loss. It causes life to be lost. And so, because of the accumulated sins of the people, the high priest has to carry on this process so as to deal with the uncleanness of the people of Israel, or the defilement that is brought by human sin. Leviticus 16, verses 18 and 19, you're going to notice that we are focusing on Leviticus because this particular book, and especially chapter 16, focuses on the Day of Atonement. Verses 18 and 19, Leviticus 16, and he, the high priest, shall go out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it. I want you to notice, he is making atonement for the altar. You remember when the sinner confesses their sin, the blood is brought in and part of it is put on the horns of the altar. Now, the high priest is making atonement for the altar because even the altar has been defiled before the Lord. So he makes atonement for it. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull, some of the blood of the goat, and he shall bring it to the horns of the altar to make atonement for it. Verse 19, and he shall sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times to cleanse it, to consecrate it from the uncleanness of the children of Israel. So this is dealing with sin. This is God's way of dealing with sin. He is now having to make a special atonement to take away the defilement from the sanctuary. Leviticus chapter 16, verses 20 and 21. And when he had made an end of atoning for the holy place, the tabernacle of meeting, the altar, he shall then bring the live goat, the goat that was not killed among those 2 goats, the one that was not killed. That is now brought forward. Verse 21, and Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the goat, confess on it all the iniquities of the people of Israel, and all their transgressions concerning all their sins, putting them on the head of the goat, and he shall send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a strong person. I want you to notice what's happening here. The goat that is known as the scapegoat, or the goat of Azazel, that goat is not killed at the altar. That goat is brought before the Lord, and then the high priest confesses on its head all the sins of the people. It's a process of transference. I want you to think of it this way. You have been cleaning up your yard. You have been raking all the stuff. You have been using the rake and bringing it closer and closer to yourself. Now finally, you have made it a big pile that is standing by you. But you don't want to spend your day standing in front of this trash pile that you have been raking from the different corners of your yard. You have brought all of it close to yourself now. It's sitting there right in the center of the yard, and it's sitting there right by your side because you have been raking it towards yourself. Now, something needs to be done to take away this trash. So I want you to picture in your mind that when you have done this process, you are feeling good that the cleaning of your yard is now almost complete. But it's not quite complete, because if this trash pile remains in the center of your yard, what do the visitors say when they come and see a whole pile of trash from all corners of your yard now piled in the center of your yard? That's not good. And so you're going to get perhaps a wheelbarrow, and you are going to take all this trash and put it into a wheelbarrow. You are going to take this wheelbarrow out of your yard to a proper place of refuse where you drop these things, and maybe you cover them up so that they are no longer in front of your house. This is what God is doing through the high priest. So verse 21 says that the high priest lays his hands on top of this goat, and all the accumulated sins of the people that have been brought to the sanctuary all through the year, they are now laid on this goat. And this goat, which is not killed, is now walked away at the hands of a strong man into the wilderness. So it goes away, bearing the sins of the people of God. Verse 22, it says, the goat shall bear on itself all their iniquities to an uninhabited land, and he shall release the goat into the wilderness. So the goat is simply set loose in an area that's not inhabited by people. It's not left in the center of the village. It's not in the common thoroughfares of life. It is left out in the woods where it will perish on its own. Maybe some wild animal might kill it and destroy it. I want you to notice that on the Day of Atonement, we are talking about ultimate cleansing. I want you to notice in verses 29 and 30, Leviticus 16, verses 29 and 30, this shall be a statute before you in the 7th month. On the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict your souls. I want you to take note. You shall afflict your souls and not do any work, whether a native of your own country or a stranger who dwells among you. So that's a very special day, the Day of Atonement. On that day, you are supposed to be searching your soul. You are supposed to be afflicting your soul on that day. I want you to notice in verse 30, for on that day the priest shall make atonement for you, to cleanse you, that you may be clean from all your sins before the Lord. I think I have to read that one again. I want to read it more slowly. I want it to sink into our consciousness what God is doing on the Day of Atonement. For on that day, the priest shall make atonement for you, to cleanse you, that you may be clean from all your sins before the Lord. So the Day of Atonement is a day of ultimate cleansing. It is a day when someone who was once a sinner but who has confessed their sin is made ultimately clean. So sin is no longer kept somewhere in the sanctuary. It is totally taken away. My sin is taken away and disposed of completely on the Day of Atonement. So that's a day of ultimate cleansing. I want you to notice, it says that the priest is making atonement for you to cleanse you so that you may be clean. So he is cleansing you so that you may be clean. So he's not cleansing you so that you remain somewhat clean, somewhat dirty. He's cleansing you so that you may be clean from all your sins before the Lord. Now, this is not clean from all your sins before the people. No. People don't have a correct assessment of sin and cleansing. Only God, the one who made the law, the one against whom we have sinned, only He knows what it means to make a sinner clean. So on that day, God makes you clean from all your sins before the Lord, so that God looks at you and God can say, child, you're really clean. That happens on the Day of Atonement, to be totally clean, completely clean, not somewhat clean, not partly clean, not somewhat acceptable, not within acceptable levels of cleanness, but to be totally clean, to be ultimately clean before the Lord. That's the function of the Day of Atonement. It says in verses 33 and 34, then he shall make atonement for the sanctuary, and he shall make atonement for the tabernacle of meeting, for the altar, and he shall make atonement for the priests, and for all the people of the assembly. This shall be an everlasting statute to make an atonement for the children of Israel for all their sin once a year. And he did as the Lord commanded Moses. That is, Aaron did as the Lord had commanded. I want you to notice the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is a special day. The daily ministry, the ministry that went on day by day, was to deal with the daily sins of individuals, focus on my individual forgiveness and removing sin from me so that I can be free. But it did not deal with ultimate freedom from sin. The yearly Day of Atonement focused on the removal of accumulated sin, removing defilement, removing the record of sin, the remembrance of sin, removing it ultimately from God's universe. So on the Day of Atonement, God takes away sin. He deals with the concept of ultimate cleanness of the ones who come to him. So God is able to cleanse us. Jesus is able to cleanse us completely because he ever liveth to make intercession for those who come to God through him. All the trash on the Day of Atonement is carried away. All the sin is carried away on that day. My memory of sin can now be taken away. I can be free from sin. I can be ultimately clean before God. I thank God for a God who made available the services of the Day of Atonement so that I can be completely clean. I thank God for this kind of God who does not want to keep a record of sin. He doesn't want me to keep looking at the center of the yard and seeing a reminder of my sin. I thank God for being this kind of God who takes away sin completely, who makes me free, who removes the record of sin so that I can no longer see it. I can no longer remember it. I'm totally free from the record of sin. What a wonderful God he is. I pray that as we study together about the sanctuary, we may come to appreciate this kind of God, the God who cleanses ultimately and makes us perfectly clean. May God bless you.